everybody, good day. Welcome to Chess News. Today I want to take a look at a game that was played between Peter Svidler from Russia and Vasily Ivanchuk from Ukraine during the 8th round of the FIDE Grand Prix in Sochi. This round was played on the same day that the Olympics in Beijing was opened. Okay, so Peter Svidler was playing white and Ivanchuk was playing black, and he managed to win a very nice game. Okay, let's go over to the action. Svidler opened with e4, then followed e5, so an open game. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and now Ivanchuk plays the so-called Berlin defense or Berlin wall with knight f6. And apparently Peter Svidler didn't feel like going into the main lines, and he opted here for the somewhat modest but fine d3. Now the problem with this move is that black probably already has about equal play. Maybe white has a slight pull from this opening. Anyway, bishop c5 was played, a very natural developing move by Ivanchuk. Now c3 was played to contest the d4 square a little bit and to play with the idea of playing d3, d4 later on. And now, also quite remarkable, Ivanchuk castles. And usually in our chess club or wherever, we learn that we should be careful with playing castles if our opponent can pin the knight in that case. Which is exactly what Peter Svidler does. He plays here bishop g5. And since this bishop is already on c5, it would of course mean the loss of a tempo if it were to retreat here to e7 to block the pin, as it were. So that cannot have been Ivanchuk's intention. But the position is still theoretically known, and apparently it is possible for black to play like this, even though the pin against the knight on f6 is quite nasty if you don't know how to handle it. So d6 is now played. This is of course the normal move. This now opens up also the diagonal for this bishop and of course enforces the stronghold on e5 in the center. And now white plays knight b d7. And we can see, of course, what the problem is of the pin. The problem is that the knight cannot move, because then the queen will be lost. But if the queen moves, then, of course, bishop takes f6 will double the pawns here. And that would leave black with a very exposed king position. So how do you go about that? Well, I suppose one option that you see is to play, for instance, and let me get rid of these colors first, because otherwise it will be too confusing. One option would be to play queen e7 to free the d8 square for the knight, which then could go to e6, and from e6 it is attacking the bishop. So that would be one try to try and get rid of that pin. The other option is of course the root option, which Ivanchuk plays. He now plays h6, just simply putting the question to the bishop. But Svidler maintains the pin with h4, like everybody would do, yeah? And now Ivanchuk is very principled, and he plays here g5. Now, I suppose this could be the subject for a whole new chapter, and we could look at it some other time. Because the question now to ask, can't white sacrifice a piece here for 2 pawns in order to try and maintain the pin against this knight? And try and put the pressure against this knight by means of queen f3, etc. And what about this king? Isn't this king in a little bit of danger? Yes, of course it is possible for white to play like that, and you get a lot of very interesting complications from this kind of sacrifice. But like I said, let's return to the game for a moment, because we can look at this for another half hour or so. In the game, Svidler opted not to sacrifice the knight, but to modestly retreat the bishop to g3, which is of course also fine. It doesn't spoil anything. Now, in pushing his pawns to e5 and g5, it means of course that black now has a stronghold here on f4, and he has also managed to unpin his knight. So he now plays with his knight and goes for the f4 square. Knight h5, very logical. And Svidler now plays an interesting but maybe slightly dubious move. Whether he had prepared this opening idea or not is not so clear. Anyway, I saw on EuropeEchec.com an interview with Ivanchuk, who said that he was really quite surprised by the method that Svidler is using now. Svidler wants to play d3, d4. But in order to do so, he first wants to remove one of the defenders of the d4 square. So he starts here by voluntarily giving up his bishop of the white squares and plays bishop takes c6. Now, of course, this is not without an idea. Like I mentioned before, the idea is to play here after b takes c6, d3, d4, which is what Svidler played during the game. But you should always remember that giving up the bishop pair is quite a significant concession in positions of these types. Now Ivanchuk decides to capture in the center, because if he would move his bishop to b6, let's have a look at that new variation, then white might consider to take here, because this pawn is weak, of course, it's attacked 3 times. He might also consider to try and chase the bishop with a4, a5 possibly. So Ivanchuk decides to open up the game a little bit, and he takes here in the center with his pawn. Now Svidler takes with his knight, and this has a number of advantages. It attacks the pawn on c6, it also attacks the knight on h5, and it also keeps an eye on the f5 square, which has become weak in white's camp. Now, first, in order to save his knight on h5, Ivanchuk now also takes the other bishop on g3, and Svidler recaptures with his h-pawn. And now we slowly see the contours of the battle. White is very strong here on the white squares, and he also has an open h-file to work with. Black, on the other hand, has the pair of bishops, and is quite strong on the black squares, and he will make use of that, playing queen f6. Now, what does this do? It attacks, of course, the knight on d4, and the knight on d4 has some trouble moving away. For instance, it cannot take on c6 now, because then, of course, queen takes f2 would be checkmate. And last but not least, I shall add that arrow also. This queen move protects the pawn on h6, very important also. And it seems as though Svidler is going astray from this moment. He keeps on playing second best moves, it seems, and Ivanchuk manages to overplay his opponent by using the bishop pair in a very effective way. So Svidler first plays here knight b, d2, to attack the bishop, like this, and to protect his own knight on d4. But probably better would have been to play queen a4, because this also protects the knight on d4, it develops an extra piece, it adds some pressure to c6, and it also opens up the possibility for queenside castles, when maybe white could really start thinking about an attack along the h-file. Anyway, Svidler didn't play like that. He played knight b to d2, and of course Ivanchuk now saves his bishop. Still, it is not possible now for Svidler to take on c6 because of the threat against f2. But Svidler must have thought to solve that problem with his next move, queen f3. But in doing so, he also offers the exchange of queens, which Ivanchuk now plays. queen takes f3, g takes f3. But now that the queens have disappeared, the fact that black's king side is weak is not so important anymore. So the fact that black now has a pair of bishop becomes more important than the other fact I just mentioned. So now it really becomes a battle of bishop against knight, and we will see that Ivanchuk already has quite a nice plus in this position. Now it would have been possible to play c5, of course, to save the pawn on c6, but that would also block the diagonal of the bishop against f2. No, Ivanchuk plays here the very strong king g7. Now this protects the pawn on h6 and allows white to take the pawn on c6. And probably that is what Svidler should have done, to take the pawn on c6 like that. But then after f7, f5, white can try to open up the f-file. He can also try to gain some access to the white squares for his white square bishop, and black would be very active. But maybe the game is still in a balance because white has an extra pawn to the goods. However, after king g7, I suppose Svidler was afraid of this possibility of black playing f7, f5, and he decided to shut the door on that option with g4. Maybe not realizing sufficiently that black also has another option to open up the game, which in fact Ivanchuk plays. He now plays the very strong d5. If you have the bishop pair, you should open up the position. And probably again knight c6 would have been best, and then for instance d takes e4, f takes e4, bishop takes g4. But also in this position black would enjoy a nice advantage. However, after d5, Svidler decided to play the check here on f5. But now this is a very opportune moment for Ivanchuk to exchange one of his bishops against this knight, which would otherwise be very strong, of course, because it is on a support point, and there is also an immediate tactic because of the threat here against h6. So Ivanchuk is probably forced to take that knight. And now probably it would have been safest to take with the e-pawn, to try and remove this pressure from the d5 pawn against the pawn here on e4, so as not to open up the d-line, for instance, and also to keep this pawn at bay and to keep this pawn at bay. And then after a move like rook fe8 check, king f1, I suppose that black still enjoys an advantage with c5, but it would probably have not been so terrible as in the game. In the game, Svidler chose to recapture on f5, not with his e-pawn, which would have kept the position a bit more static to my feeling, but g takes f5. Now this has the added disadvantage that now the h-pawn has become a free pawn. And of course, like mentioned, there is still this tension here between these two center pawns. And if they get exchanged, it also means that this pawn here on f5 will become weaker, etc, etc, etc. Notice that white's knight also, by the way, has no active role to fulfill, whereas black's bishop is very nicely attacking this weak pawn here on f2. This will also play a role a little later on. So after g takes f5, Ivanchuk now immediately started putting pressure on the remaining pawn on e4, and Svidler protected it with knight d2. And Ivanchuk now played rook a to d8, and this has the very nice threat again of taking on e4, because it would not be possible to recapture with the f-pawn. Let's have a look at that. For instance, if white were to play a non-move like a3, let's add that, then it would be possible to take here. And now if black white does not completely want to ruin his pawn structure and does not want to recapture with the knight, he should recapture with the pawn. But then all of a sudden, because of the attack of the rook on the knight on d2, there is this nice deflection move of bishop takes on f2, and black is winning. So that is the threat after rook a d8. probably the best way to counter that would have been to play rook h2. But I can imagine that that is not a move that Peter Svidler seriously considered, because it just, you know, it looks horrible to play a move like that, so passive. But anyway, he played here rook d1, and now he is really starting to lose the game, because Ivanchuk can now open up the d file like this. Svidler recaptured here with the f-pawn, which has now become possible because bishop f2 would now be a blunder, since the knight on d2 is protected by the rook on d1. But now Ivanchuk comes up with the strong rook d5. And this threatens to win the pawn on f5. And there is really no defense to this anymore, because if you push the pawn, yeah, I suppose maybe that would have been an option. Let's have a look at that. Svidler could have tried to push the pawn like this, and then of course black cannot take it immediately because of the fact that the h6 pawn is also hanging. But after king g6, I suppose it's just a matter of postponing the execution. Yeah, like this. Yeah, one of the things that black is threatening here to play like this, for instance. Yeah. So that also would not have helped Svidler a lot. But maybe he could have tried f3, but then of course he also loses the pawn on f5. Anyway, in the game after rook d5 he played king e2. And then there followed rook takes f5, which has now become possible. And this threatened, of course, the pawn on f2. Sorry, this is a no! This is a crooked diagonal. Yeah, this is a good one. And now Svidler played his final two moves: rook h2 defending, but rook f4 re-enters the possibility of playing f5, and after f3, f5, black has so much pressure on white's position that Svidler decided here to resign the game. Quite probably black will win another pawn. His bishop is much stronger than the knight, and there is also this free h-pawn to reckon with. So it is quite understandable that Svidler had had enough. Maybe he is still suffering also from his backache, and well, it's still not clear what his idea with bishop takes c6. Maybe he could have played more precise moves, such as to take on c6 earlier somewhere, or maybe to recapture on f5 with the e-pawn. But in the end, the bishops managed to beat the knights, as they do so often. Okay, so that ends our discussion of this nice technical game by Ivanchuk. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please, until next time. Bye bye.